This What's Working with Cam Marston podcast is brought to you courtesy of Michelob Ultra Beer.
They say consistency is the key to success. They weren't wrong. So how about grabbing a beer that's consistently smooth, consistently refreshing, and consistently light? You might just find that the road to success can be pretty enjoyable. Michelob Ultra, the perfect balance of taste and refreshment, and only 2.6 carbs and 95 calories. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. Enjoy responsibly. Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
All right, let's do this. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is the show designed to bring you insight into the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace trends that are shaping the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace around us. I want you to listen to this show, hear something in it, apply it to yourself, your work, your business, your life, your family, and I want it to make you a little bit better at whatever it is that you do. That's the goal. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate, housed in the Culverhouse College of Business at the University of Alabama. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining the ride here. I'm going to put Blake Mobley on the line momentarily. I met him at a conference several weeks ago, heard his presentation, and it was so very compelling, so very insightful that I approached him afterwards and I said, I'd love it if you would spend time with me on the radio show. Blake does some remarkable stuff, and you'll hear that in his introduction when I get him on the line, pulling out of his bio, pulling content out of his bio. But what I think he's going to offer listeners is you and me. What he's going to offer us is insight into how to interview, because and how to give a conversational interview, how to ask questions, what types of questions to ask, what to look for in answers. Because in using his processes, it's risk mitigation is what it is. He's going to teach us how to interview people better so that we can find better fits for our companies and our teams and our cultures. And he's going to tell us how to go about this. His expertise, and this is so cool, his expertise comes in his background in the CIA. And he continued developing it many times after the CIA. But it originated in the CIA in the counterterrorism units, learning how to find assets. Now, he uses all kind of language for this, but he essentially is a CIA guy trying to find people who are willing to turn on their organization and share information with the CIA that will allow the CIA to advance the CIA's, the United States, interests. And he learns how to interview, and he learns how to ask questions, and he learns what to listen for so that he can determine if this would be a good asset for the CIA to invest in. He's taken this skill and begun applying it to the corporate world, teaching organizations how to better interview to get at what's important in the candidate. We're going to talk about confirmation bias, which is a problem in every interview. We think we're going to like these people, so we find ways to like them. The other side, we think we're not going to like them, so we find ways to not like them. He's going to talk us about how to resist confirmation bias as best as we can, but how to listen for answers and how to reframe questions and how to summarize. It's really his expertise in the CIA was very helpful to our nation back when he was operating within the CIA. That same expertise is now being applied to businesses. He's working with businesses to teach them how to ask the appropriate questions. And you're going to love this. His presentation, we don't even get into in this show what his presentation was on, which is the beginning of chaos and entropy and the downfall of society, which is kind of fascinating. But we are going to get into how to go about interviewing people, and we'll do that as soon as we come back from this break. A couple things before we go to the break, and I'd be fool not to say the book is out, man. What Works? The top 10 ideas from the first 200 episodes. You can find it on Amazon.com. Enter my name. In that book, I highlight the best ideas from the first 200 episodes of the What's Working radio show. Not the best interviews, the best ideas. And I catalog these ideas in such a way that hopefully you can take them and do something with them in your own business. So what works? Find it on Amazon.com. It should be available on my website soon. There's all kinds of shopping cart stuff that I don't know how to do. All right, before we go to break, not every financial planner is certified. A certified financial planner is someone who has dedicated themselves to the 4 E's of financial planning: education, examination, experience, and ethics. Both Jamie Sandifer and Mark Salyers are certified financial planners at Sandifer Wealth Management. Check them out at sandiferwealthmanagement.com. Google that name. I know these guys, and I wouldn't put my money in the hands of anybody that's not a CFP, quite frankly. It's that important. That designation to me is that important. Check them out. You'll like them as much as I do. When we come back from break, Blake Mobley talking to us about how to better interview. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate, housed in the Culverhouse College of Business, all housed at the University of Alabama.
Cool thing happened back in '64. That's when Keith Air Conditioning opened their doors.
In my family, turn to the experts is more than a tagline. It's a promise. Every Keith technician is an experienced AC professional, and that saves you money. Speaking of money, how about 0% financing for up to 60 months on installations of new Carrier systems? Keith and Carrier, turn to the experts.
Mobile's leading name in comfort since 1964.
License number 83731.
We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate, housed in the Culverhouse College of Business at the University of Alabama. On the line right now, Blake Mobley from his home in San Diego, California. I heard his presentation a couple of weeks ago at a conference in Kiowa Island, South Carolina, and was completely taken aback by it. Let me give you a bit of his bio, and we'll get into the content. Blake served as a counterintelligence officer at the CIA, supporting clandestine operations and senior U.S. policymakers, including 2 presidents and their cabinets. I'm going to jump ahead. He holds a PhD in political science from Georgetown, a master's degree in public policy from Harvard, and a BA in psychology from Stanford University. Blake, perhaps the most educated guest we've ever had on this show. Thank you so much for your time, and welcome to What's Working.
Yeah, absolutely.
So your bio is very compelling. I'm going to pick and choose from it as we go along in this conversation, but why don't you give the listeners a little bit more of your background, who you are, what you've done, where you've been, stuff like this that I thought I was just so taken with when I heard your presentation a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So really started my career at the CIA. That was sort of the first real job that I had. And I was working on a PhD at the time and really interested in something called counterintelligence, which is the set of activities a company or a government engages in to keep its secrets. So really was very interested in that and started work at a place called the Counterintelligence Center. And what they do is they provide support to the CIA and the broader intelligence community to understand how our secrets could be attacked and stolen, and also how do we do better at capturing more secrets, which usually comes in the form of, for the CIA, recruiting human assets. So what I was doing there was counterintelligence analysis, and targeting is a really big piece of that. And that is the art of identifying targets, people in positions where they have access to secrets, and getting them to see the benefits of their working on behalf of the U.S. government to help geopolitical stability. I mean, any number of topics you could imagine that assets could be very interested in joining our team. So that was a big piece of what we were doing. And it was tremendously fun. I was posted to the Middle East for a couple years and had an amazing time doing that. And eventually found my way to a think tank in 2012 called RAND. And there we did some really interesting work on understanding clandestine networks and continued working with some of the various 3-letter agencies for various projects. And at that point, I'd written a book about terrorist group counterintelligence and understanding the dynamics of how they keep their secrets and how they failed to keep their secrets. Most importantly, that was a piece of the book. Where are the structural weaknesses that are unavoidable depending on a decision they make about how to structure their group and understand how they control territory? Inevitably comes with really stark disadvantages and produces some pretty debilitating results. So if you know where to look, you can take advantage of that. Jumped from RAND to a career in biotech as a chief information officer. Did that for 8 years and was kind of the first part of where I got really interested in talent management, talent strategy, and human resources, and made a shift in my career at that point, using some of the same lessons from the psychology of understanding counterintelligence assets and keeping secrets. Those same dynamics applied in HR turned out to be tremendously powerful. I'm every day learning more about talent management and how people think and what motivates them, but certainly a really interesting background to start in counterintelligence to try to understand and get people to be comfortable enough to see what motivates them. Some people are really connected with that, and some people are kind of learning as they go. So I did that for about 8 years and then jumped to a really cool company that I'm at right now called Waste Fuel. And I work for them on special projects. And they are a company involved in producing renewable fuels from municipal solid waste. So picture a city dump. They have figured out how to turn that into green methanol, and then they sell that to various off-takers. So that's been a lot of fun. And also I've had the honor and benefit of co-founding a company in the recruiting space called Keeper Recruiting. And very interesting kind of approach where we have a special way of screening people and matching great candidates for the great companies. So we do deep evaluations on both sides of those measures and try to make those matches. And we feel like we're doing a really interesting job of getting to the core of what drives companies and what drives people, and then match them up. So that's kind of in a nutshell where I've come from and where I'm headed.
I think it's phenomenal that with all this education, you're now working on getting capturing so many things, but you're working on capturing methane as it oozes out of the city dump. It's like, this guy's is absolutely got this extraordinary pedigree, but if it smells bad at the dump, he's really interested in it or something
Absolutely.
like that. Yeah. It's
some of the best things in life come from some of the dirtiest spots. So I think if you can find arbitrage in those places, absolutely.
So I want to, and what we're going to get into, I'm going to speak to the listeners here. What we're going to get into is insights into recruiting and retaining people, and using the skills that you learned at the CIA as you tried to recruit people to become informants to the CIA. There's psychology in there, there are lessons in there, and we're going to definitely dig into that because my listeners, Blake, want to know how to find better people and keep them. And that is a really big problem, I think, everywhere, but I can speak to the state of Alabama where the unemployment rate, I think, is now at 2.8%. They want to know what to do to recruit and retain people, and find them is a big part of it as well. But I do want to go back into the CIA component of what you were doing. You were in the Middle East for a couple of years, and you said that there's some vulnerabilities that any organization can have. And when you figure out where their vulnerabilities are, you can gain access to the information those people have. Is that sum it up nearly appropriately?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the really interesting features that would apply in the business space too are that terrorist groups and rebel groups usually have a decision, and they typically make the decision in one way, but they have a decision at one point, which is to be very hierarchically oriented or more flat and decentralized. And though there are enormous advantages to being decentralized, it turns out that being centralized and more hierarchical gives a lot more control. And with control, you can induce more counterintelligence friendly behaviors. You can train people more effectively. You can motivate them. You can appreciate their morale and analyze your own group more effectively if you're hierarchically designed. But it produces one gigantic vulnerability, which is sometimes the very end and the death of the group, which is that a tightly organized group is vulnerable to a single penetration, a single source working for an intelligence service that can give them access to every secret that organization has.
I see. So give me an example. Pick a terrorist agency that I would be familiar with, not the intimate details of it, but give me an example.
So one example, a great example, is the Provisional Republican Irish Republican Army. They, in the 1990s, were still very active and engaged in numerous very violent campaigns. And the British government and the police organizations in Northern Ireland were obviously dedicated to stopping them. They had started very hierarchical early in their existence. And then when the police got very clever and started penetrating them and having lots of assets, they decentralized, and then they came back together in sort of a compartmented way. So that's a nice strategy. Actually, it's a balance between hierarchy and decentralization. But a fascinating book, if you have the time to read it, is a book called Steak Knife. And it's about a gentleman who was the head of the IRA's, the PIRA's counterintelligence unit. And he was a recruited asset of the British.
Interesting.
And he gave them access to so much detail that the Brits were able to manage that group much more effectively than they otherwise could have. So really vulnerable. They got right to the top of the organization. And because he was in charge of counterintelligence, he could actually direct investigations within the IRA away from himself. He was in charge of those investigations. So he would implicate other people who were members of the IRA, so not quite innocent, but innocent of the crimes from which he was being held responsible. He could point it in their direction and escape being investigated. So he was really effective at that. And really nasty guy, did a lot of nasty things and spied for some really complex, interesting, basic human reasons. So nothing too complicated. Some of it just came down to his ego and feeling like he was sidelined in the decision-making processes. And so he got back by solving his problem, quote unquote, solving his problem by doing this one act. So their understanding his psychology made a huge difference and made it disastrous for the IRA.
So is there any parallel between a vertically structured terrorist organization and a vertically structured company? I would think not, because a terrorist organization is trying to live under the radar and is trying to do illegal things. So there's not exactly, you can't see lessons learned in your study of these terrorist organizations say, hey, here's a model we can apply to a business in a beneficial way.
Well, I think there are some ways, you're right, it's a stretch, but there's certainly some ways where there are useful parallels. I'd say for a company that's striving to protect its culture and to promote the values, its core values, if you're very decentralized, if you have a largely remote workforce, you're going to encounter more difficulties doing that. So the more hierarchical the group, the better shot it has at distributing and training people in a host of different things, everything from cybersecurity to compliance issues. But certainly on the culture piece, being able to reinforce that every day and to have key leaders reinforce that would be really important. But so then what's the vulnerability on the counter side? Really toxic leaders in hierarchical organizations can make a really big and bad difference. So if the leadership's struggling to set a culture and there's some toxicity, decentralization might be one of the benefits you could learn from that.
We need to go to break. When we come back, I want to start getting into this conversation about recruiting and retention, which I know is a sore spot for so many of my listeners. I'm on the line with Blake Mobley from San Diego, California. His background is remarkable. I'll give you a little bit more of that when we come back from break, and we'll start talking about this recruiting and retention challenge. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate at the Culverhouse College of Business at the University of Alabama.
They say consistency is the key to success. They weren't wrong. So how about grabbing a beer that's consistently smooth, consistently refreshing, and consistently light? You might just find that the road to success can be pretty enjoyable. Michelob Ultra, the perfect balance of taste and refreshment, and only 2.6 carbs and 95 calories. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. Enjoy responsibly. Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Customer service never goes out of style. In fact, I think it's safe to say that customer service is more valuable and more important now more than ever. Hi, this is Cam Marston. One thing that my over 200 episodes of What's Working has taught me is how important customer service is to building and maintaining a thriving business. It's the growing need for customer service that's led me to partner with one of the state's leading customer service trainers to create our program called Delivering 5-Star Customer Service. Your team will get one 90-minute training session per month for 6 consecutive months. Each session builds on the skills learned the previous month, allowing your customer-facing teams to practice before moving on to the next lesson. And the 6 lessons address everything from appearance to electronic communications to conflict resolution to maintaining a service mindset. Our program travels and is delivered in person at your workplace, nothing virtual. You simply can't practice the level of the skills this course teaches virtually. For more information, email me, cam@cammarston.com, and let's schedule a time to talk. Remember, you have less to fear from outside competition than you do from discourtesy and bad service from inside your own company. Again, email me, cam@cammarston.com, and let's talk about your business. Blake Mobley is on the line with me. He's the author of Terrorism and Counterintelligence, Evading Secret Police, and other books and articles on the topics of political instability, counterintelligence, and insider threats. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate at the Culver House College of Business, all at the University of Alabama. Blake, prior to the break, we were talking a little bit about this recruiting and retention challenge. So I'm assuming at some point in your counterintelligence training, whether it was with the CIA or with the organization you listed after that, or perhaps even with RAND, there was a study required of you, or perhaps taught to you, about how to ask questions. I mean, is it as simple as that? How to ask questions, or is it how to ask the right questions? Is it how to watch for feedback? Because I know many of my listeners have an interview process, and they are frustrated that their interview process is not finding people who are willing to be loyal to the organization, and their turnover numbers are high. So take us back to how you learned this skill, and keeping in mind my business-oriented listeners, if there are lessons that you can impart to them as we go through this.
Absolutely. So there isn't a single manual or guide to interviewing techniques. Certainly the government teaches some behavioral interviewing techniques, but everyone who's really good at this, I have found, pieces together information in a slightly different way. For example, a great interviewer, Howard Stern, if you just listen to how he gets his guests to open up, he's very persistent, and that kind of works for him. I don't know if that would work for everybody. So he's got an interesting technique. Some people have an approach where they have a few certain baseline questions that they'll ask of every person, and use that to gauge the person in front of them, versus someone else they have in the organization that's performing very well, or vice versa. My sense has always been that I do best, and I think it's a good technique for others to take more of the gestalt of the whole conversation. So as you're working through a conversation with someone, you only have, let's say, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. You are listening carefully for the words they're choosing to use, how they describe their ideal manager. And there isn't any sort of gotcha question, but I do find it's useful to pay attention to probably at least 4 things. The first would be, I think you tend to get the most out of people, the most honest answers when they're off script. So that's usually not in the first few minutes of a conversation, but as soon as you start asking novel questions, that's where you get pay dirt. If you're asking questions that they might have practiced or that they've likely thought about a lot. So for example, why did you leave this job and go to the next? If they've practiced that answer, or they've just given that answer several times, there's less interesting information typically in that. So as soon as you're asking novel questions and off script, that's when you're really getting to some of these interesting personality characteristics. There's a few others that I think are really interesting. First of all, people generally are oriented towards an entitlement versus a gratitude approach. And I think that comes out in how they answer questions, how they talk about challenges they faced? Was the challenge about something that happened to them, they were a victim, or do they look at it as that was a learning opportunity? So those typically come out in questions about, tell me about a challenge. I think one of the more interesting things that's really easy to detect pretty early is the energy level. That turns out to be really important, I think, in most jobs and for most culture fitness questions. Are they high energy? Are they low energy? It's not a challenge if they're low energy. It's just something you have to deal with and think about what's the appropriate role, what kind of team are they going to be on, and how are they going to integrate with that lower energy approach. So it's a fine thing to have, but it needs to fit with the job description. And then there's another thing that I usually find that's pretty interesting. And this is, again, something that has been useful in the career and that came up in a lot of these different contexts, was whether the person is ordered or is order or chaos focused. Sort of, do they have a high tolerance for chaos, or do they need order? So you get to that. Certainly certain types of jobs obviously require the person to have a structured thinking. So that is usually pretty telling. If the person approaches actually responding to interview questions in an ordered way, you get a lot of those indicators from how people interact really early on. And then what, the choices they made, the things they decided to study in college usually is a giveaway for those things too. So that's kind of a bucket of interview techniques and things that I would usually try to get at in the course of that 30 minutes.
I'm interested in I've written these down. You've off script, entitlement versus opportunity. That's number 2. You didn't use those exact words, but do they have an entitlement mindset or a learning or opportunity mindset? Energy. Yeah. And number 4, order versus chaos. But let's go back to the off script question. So, and I want to ask you about confirmation bias as well. But the off script questions, you can throw. I've read these things about these very random, seemingly questions that are designed to seemingly trip up the interviewer. The interviewee, to see where their mind goes. Is there any value in that? So if I'm going through an interview with somebody and I come up with the most crazy question I'd ever think of, does their reaction to that question matter, or is it the fact that it's a crazy question eliminate the necessity of the question or the value of the question?
Yeah, it's one of those it depends kind of answers. So it may. I think if any one question and answer are probably not as interesting as the collection of the 30 questions and answers that come across an entire scope of an interview. So if let's say you're asking a probing, challenging question, that is, you're going to let the person feel a little bit on their heels, because you're going to say, instead of, why did you move from company X to Y? You'd say, that's interesting and strange that you moved so quickly. Tell me about that. So you're kind of critiquing what they did. That's usually a lighter way to get someone to feel a little bit off center and a little bit off script, and then maybe they're be a little defensive, but you'll see a little bit how that person reacts. But if the rest of the interview, they're very calm and you're not worried about any of these features, then it's probably not too meaningful if they get a little distracted because it's a little bit of a crazy question. But if you're working towards a hypothesis of how this person operates and they become very defensive, just like you thought they might, then you're getting closer to a reading that you're more comfortable with. So it kind of depends on all the collection, the mosaic of the approach. So
the hypothesis that you're creating, to use the term you mentioned a moment ago, could lend itself to confirmation bias. In other words, here's the way this person is appearing, and this is either the person I want or don't want, and you're weighing in on that well before the entirety of the interview is complete. Can you talk about how to suspend confirmation bias in these conversations? Because I read things like people... they'll interview somebody, and if they get along with them, if they like them for whatever reason, we went to the same university, they're going to want to select them regardless of what that interview reveals or the interviewee reveals in their conversation. How do you stay alert to your own confirmation bias?
Yeah, so it's a huge challenge. Confirmation bias obviously comes into play even before you start the interview based on the person's CV, how you're feeling that day. So there's a lot that's being affected there. Can you avoid it completely? Almost certainly not. But one of the techniques that I think is pretty effective that the interviewee appreciates too is as we're working through a hypothesis about how the person is most likely to succeed in the job that they're interviewing for, to read it back to them and ask them to comment and critique. So you might say, it seems like you're the kind of person that is going to be really effective environments where your manager is really supporting you, and that relationship with the manager. It sounds like that's maybe one of the most important things. Tell me if that's wrong. How do you have examples of where that hasn't been true? So kind of ask the counterfactual, and if they come back to you and say, "Yeah, that sounds about right," then you're probably not right. But if they come back and say, "You nailed it. In fact, let me tell you something else about how important that feature is."
Wow.
When I was a kid, my parents would always say, so you get to that moment where they start talking about other parts of their lives and how that actually applies and how it's helpful for them to think about it that way. If you don't end up in that spot where you get that nice connection with somebody where they're confirming and giving you more information and looking at counterfactuals, then you're returning that interview result with lower confidence. So I think this might be how this person is, but we'll have to get to know them a little bit more. I think that's probably how you might get around confirmation bias, but that it's very difficult. That's a challenging one.
When we come back from break, let's talk about multiple interviews, whether it's valuable, whether you can sum someone up in one sitting, or it's best that you do this over a period of days or weeks to let time and reflection over the previous conversation script perhaps future questions. So we'll talk about that when we come back. And I also want to hear a little bit more about the entitlement and the opportunity focus, because we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago who had something similar to say. And his was about intellectual humility. And I want to talk to you about that. His name is Marty Strong. He's the author of the book, Be Nimble. He's a former Navy SEAL, and he's written a very compelling business book on attitudes of CEOs towards their work. Anyway, we'll pick this up in a moment. Blake Mobley's with me. He's from San Diego right now. He is currently the chief data officer at a renewable fuels company. Prior to that was the CIO of a mid-sized biotech company. He's done a little bit of everything. We're talking about his science, or perhaps science is a stretch, but his disciplines around interviewing and what you can learn from it that stem from his time in the CIA. You're listening to What's Working. We'll be right back after this. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate.
A cool thing happened back in '64. That's when Keith Air Conditioning opened their doors. And ever since then, they've earned your family's trust. Fixing your AC when it bites the dust.
It's hotter than hot season, and for 3 generations, Keith has earned your trust during the hottest time of the year. Every Keith technician is an expert, because when the heat's the worst, you need the best. So turn to the 2 names you can count on, Keith and Carrier.
Mobile's leading name in comfort since 1964.
License number 83731.
I'm on the line today with Blake Mobley. He's calling in from San Diego. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston, brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate at the Culverhouse College of Business at the University of Alabama. Blake's got a background with the CIA. He's worked with U.S. policymakers, including 2 presidents and their cabinets. His passion, it seems like, Blake, not let me steal or misapply terms, is psychology and the way people think and the way they make decisions and how their background has shaped their lives. And we're using this background, this passion of Blake's, to explore people's backgrounds to help people find ways to interview and find perfect candidates for their workplace. Now, Blake, prior to the break, I talked a little bit about this, but we had a guy on a couple of weeks ago, and this is actually the second time I've heard what this guy said in the past 3 or 4 months. 2 speakers have said the same thing, and that is the necessity of a leader today in any organization, but their argument was particularly for larger organization, is what they both referenced was intellectual humility, the ability to be humble about what you know, and more importantly about what you don't know, and the ability to quickly determine what you need to know and your willingness to learn it. Intellectual humility and nimbleness along those lines. Do you have any thoughts on that based on your experiences doing the work that you've done, and perhaps how you might find that if the listeners agree that that's something that they want their new hires to have?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't given it a ton of thought in that exact context around intellectual humility, but certainly makes a lot of sense. I think a person who is bringing that humility to the workspace is going to have a lot of features that are very productive. So one would be that they're very coachable. If there's a need for agility and there's a lot of chaos occurring and someone asks them a little differently, even if that person's right at the top and they're getting advice from someone very junior, someone with a lot of humility might say, that's an interesting question. Maybe I'll explore that and see. Or if they're really open to feedback, that is, they don't seem to be defensive when they're getting feedback. And those are usually really helpful. I like to think of, this entitlement versus gratitude. Opportunity is another way to describe a property of gratitude. But certainly I think that the approach of gratitude tends to be really useful because it gives you a space to see and a context. The mindset is that whatever I have in front of me is a gift, and even my challenges are gifts. And if you can do that, you can generally stay high energy and productive. And if you're a leader, it certainly is critical in these company cultures that he or she is espousing the key values of the company and is truly someone to look up to. Companies that struggle with that, where their culture says one thing, but the leader is doing something a little different, people pick up on that so fast, it can undermine even the things where there is consistency between the culture and the leadership.
Yeah.
So certainly the humility is really critical. And being aware of how you come across to the people you're leading, I think would matter quite a bit too.
So we talked about this prior to the break. I want to pick up on it. How important is multiple interviews? We're going to do one this week. We're going to do another one next week. And between those two times, we'll consider what we just talked about. You're gifted in what we're talking about here. This is your study. This is your craft. But the listener out there may not be so. Do you advise multiple interviews, or do you think they're more harmful than beneficial?
I think it really depends. So I don't think you need them necessarily. I think it's always valuable to have a second interviewer. So if you can get a second person's opinion, especially if they're trained to do some of the things that we were talking about, and you can get two opinions on one person, I think that might be your sweet spot. So does it need to be 3 or 4 people? It might. If the job has different features, say very technical features, and you have one person kind of looking more at the technical, the next interview might look more at the culture fit. I found that can be very effective. The only downside is you're asking a lot of a candidate to be available for interviews over weeks. And the more senior they are, she'll be more open to it because, she's a senior person. She's thinking, okay, I'm willing to have multiple interviews. I'm willing to fly somewhere and finish an interview and meet someone in person. Being in person is pretty important, I think. The more senior, you get a little different feel than you get on a phone call. But I don't think you need it, but it can certainly be helpful. I don't know, to go back to your original question, I don't know that it's useful for the same person to interview somebody again. If you can't get it in 30 or 40 minutes, you need to tighten that up. You need some training, I think.
What about a third-party interviewer? What if I were to hire you and say, Blake, I'm trying to fill this role. Here's what the role does. Here's the way the team functions. Here's the ethos of the team and the company. I need you to find this person for me because either I don't have the time to do it or I have a bad confirmation bias, whatever it may be. What do you think about a third-party interviewer?
It can be very effective if it's used in that way. So, for example, if I'm a third party and I'm playing the role of the ambassador, the diplomat, I'm just an emissary. You're not gonna work with me. I really want to understand you. I also want to understand the company. And maybe I'm sort of in between those two. So I'm not going to give you bad advice. I might tell you, I don't know this company's right for you. That kind of trusted third party can be very effective because that person might open up in different ways and say more about their true interests. And it's not to say that you're tricking a person into saying more than what they should be saying, but you're allowing them to be open enough to explore that conversation and hopefully arrive at something that's useful for them and the company.
I think any skills people can pick up that will make them a more adept interviewer at determining whether this individual will be a fit for their organization long-term or not is absolutely, particularly with the unemployment rate the way it is, people want to find people who are predictable and come to work. And I think a lot of it, and you know this more than me, a lot of this is the organization that I was somewhat promised in the interview the same organization that I'm going to show up in on my first day of work? Or do they paint a rosy picture that when I enter the doors on the first day, that rosy picture vanishes and everybody says, well, they told us the same thing, but here's what it's really like. And I think there's extraordinary value in that today as a part of building the culture of the organization, of meeting the promise that was made in the interview. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So it's what we're doing at Keeper Recruiting is just that. I mean, I'm not going to say we're doing it perfectly, but this is exactly what we're trying to do, which is learn enough about the company culture and then to have a relationship with the candidate that continues past when they're hired. So we continue talking with the company and that employee. And if you have multiple employee placements, it can be really effective, because then culture comes into play more often in the conversation. They trust you. They trust your interests are in having this person for the long run, which is why we called the company Keeper. I think there's a lot of value in it. And I'm with you that it's unusual that we haven't done this more effectively. I can say even the government, U.S. government, does not do this very effectively. Once you're hired, it's sort of good luck to you mostly. I mean, there are a lot of points where great managers come in and fill in the gaps, and great managers can keep people around and they can help translate culture and give that employee guidance early on. So they essentially play that role in this probationary period. But we are generally not good. We sort of hire and then say the managers who they got, and that's up to them. But when people end up failing in their job or wanting to leave, or perhaps even stealing from a company, the hiring staff and that company is a co-author of that destructive impulse. Wow. Because they hired the person, they gave them the training, they gave them the manager that wasn't great. So you are absolutely, now every once in a while, there are very malicious people who come in with the intention of stealing, and those you probably can't deter. But most of corporate malfeasance is going to fall into the category of crimes of opportunity, and where a person is trying to solve a personal challenge in one fell swoop. And so you'll see that in a lot of counter-espionage investigations, that the person is in a crisis and they are approached by a case officer from an adversarial country. And that case officer is very good at convincing the person that they can solve a lot of these problems right now. So they don't come in with malicious intent. They probably do have some narcissistic, sociopathic tendencies, but there are a lot of people who are that way who do just fine who never spy. So there's a co-authorship to failure in one sense. And so I think it is a little strange that we haven't put more thought into this as we've evolved in our corporate cultures.
We got a minute left. What else are you up to? A guy with your pedigree, your education pedigree, and as well as I've seen you jumping around, I don't mean that in a detrimental way, but you seem to have your hand in so many disparate pots. What else is going on with you? You got a minute.
1 minute. Well, one thing, I have a co-author who I'm working with a book right now on how resistance groups and countries can work inside police states. So police state organizations, internal security services have a very predictable set of pathologies, and we're trying to leverage that knowledge of that to give a manual for people who are involved in resistance movements. And so it's very exciting research. And I have an amazing colleague who's working with me on that. So hopefully I'll get that book out too. But that's kind of what I do in my free time right now. Yeah, just like me. I do all that stuff all the time myself too. Keeper Recruiting, Blake. Keeper Recruiting. How can people find you? So anybody is happy for anybody to give me a call anytime. And my cell is 202-615-8878. And send me a text, give me a call. My email, if they want to reach me at Keeper, is bmobley@keeperrecruiting.com. So BMOBLEY@keeperrecruiting.com. Either of those methods works. And please do reach out.
Blake, it's been a pleasure. We're grateful for your time. Thank you very much.
I'm grateful too. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.
We'll be back after this break for segment 5 and final comments. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. What's Working is brought to you by the Alabama Center for Real Estate. We'll be right back.
They say consistency is the key to success. They weren't wrong. So how about grabbing a beer that's consistently smooth, consistently refreshing, and consistently light? You might just find that the road to success can be pretty enjoyable. Michelob Ultra, the perfect balance of taste and refreshment, and only 2.6 carbs and 95 calories. It's only worth it if you enjoy it. Enjoy responsibly. Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Hey, this is T. Bruce McKinnon. I'm the president and CEO of Elevator World and Bay Business News. And when I'm not traveling the world, looking over elevators or trying to find news for the local business community, I'm listening to What's Working with Cam Marston. Now back to the show.
Blake's a compelling guy. And like I said in the intro of the show, what I heard him present on was the dissolution of society and the entropy that comes with society, the chaos that comes as societies dissolve, I guess is a better way to say it. And it was, and he studied these things. He studied them in order to better understand his terrorism work. And he then paralleled what he knows about the dissolution of societies with the United States today. And it was fantastic. It was really, really compelling stuff. And we chose not even to get into that today because the focus of the show is workplace, workforce, marketplace trends. And while the dissolution of society is pretty interesting, it really doesn't apply to the show. Nevertheless, guy brings compelling content wherever he goes. He gave he offered his cell phone number, and I'm going to say it here again. This is Blake Mobley, 202-615-8878. Give him a call. His company is Keeper Recruiting, teaching you how to ask better questions of the people in the workplace that may come to work for you. And I think there's no limits to the opportunity of being able to use this skill of interviewing people. And goodness knows it would work well in any sort of sales environment, of knowing how to ask the right questions and what to watch for in their answers. So I want to touch on a couple of things that he said that I thought were so very compelling. First, questions that are off script. If you're giving your candidate a question that they've probably gotten before or expected to get, their answer is rehearsed. It's not genuine. Find off script questions, and you'll see a little bit more of that individual. Entitlement versus gratitude, an attitude of entitlement versus an attitude of gratitude. He said most people bias towards entitlement. Find those gratitude people. You might have to search harder, but find them. And then energy. Where do they fit based on their energy? Do they fit based on their energy? And finally, do they prefer order or chaos? And you can hear that in their responses. And he referenced the way they went about college or their college majors would help you make that determination as well. Blake Mobley. Thank you, Blake, for your time. I'm grateful, and I look forward to having you back on the show. That'll wrap us up, everybody. Couple things. Find me on social media, Cam Marston. Pin me, post me, tweet me, all that kind of stuff. Find me on there. Link up, follow. You can get some more insights on the show, as well as see photos of the people that I'm interviewing, things of that nature. Hope you'll email me directly with any sort of thoughts you have about the show. Cam, C-A-M, at cammarston.com. You can go to what'sworkingcam.com to find this show as a podcast, as well as all previous shows. And you can, from there, subscribe to the podcast or forward the show on to people that you think need to hear it. I hope you will do so. The show is produced by John Thompson with Ion Digital. We'll have another show next week. Have a good week, everybody.